So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action and very honored to host you and our great panel today. Welcome to our webinar on 10 years Syria crisis, time for a new approach, ? Something to discuss today. Some housekeeping before. You will have seen the rules and you will know them very well by now, so I won't read them to you, maybe only to be sure. Please understand that we can't take everybody live on record by video and audio, but please feel more than welcome to engage in our chat and to comment and to raise questions. You will all know these procedures by now as well. In a few days, 15th March will mark the 10th anniversary of Syria crisis. And while this is a very sad date, I'm very pleased that we keep engaging on this topic. I have a personal touch to it, as you can also see on the map in my office, having been based in the WFP office, the World Food Programme, for the Syria crisis until 2019. Beyond that, of course, it's a major topic and one of the largest humanitarian crises till today. We would like to discuss with you that the ongoing conflict, the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis in Syria have accelerated the human suffering to an extent unprecedented. We have 11 million people at least in need inside Syria, let alone the refugees in the region, and many of them, of course, also in other countries. And we have a food crisis evolving, the worst since the beginning of the conflict, with at least 60% of the population suffering from hunger. At the same time, we have a government in Damascus which is in victory mood for quite a while, which is controlling large parts of the country, and negotiations about political solution, transformation, whatever, or for a start constitution is in a stalemate. In light of this, from our view, a controversial debate has started if a new approach is needed for a start for Western countries. We as CAR have engaged in this debate some weeks ago when we focused in particular on humanitarian assistance and the right way to provide assistance in the future. Together with Caritas International, the German Foreign Office, we discussed if a change of strategy is needed, evolving from purely humanitarian assistance to maybe more transitional and maybe even developmental one, as this would, on the one hand, be surely more effective, on the other hand, very political, and maybe supporting a government which Western countries tried to give incentives for transformation so far. Today, we would like to focus on two other topics which are debated more and more controversially. And one is the key tool from Western countries to influence this conflict and developments inside Syria, given that on the military side, there has been no substantial engagement from the Western side for obvious reasons until today. Sanction regimes have been the key tool to influence developments inside Syria, while they are more and more controversially discussed. One of the key experts is today with us on this topic. It's Rim Turkmani. She's research director at the London School of Economics and at the same time co-founder of the Syrian Open Coalition. And she will present a brand new study on the impact of sanction regimes and share with us from her study views like sanctions failed to change the regime or its behavior, while they resulted in a weakening of legitimate business and civil society and increased suffering from ordinary people. On that one, we will come back to Rim. Welcome, Rim, to our panel. We're really proud to have you with us. We'll come back to your study in a few minutes. But to outline what we would like to look at today, let me also touch quickly on another paper we have also published as CHAR, honored by Lena Schellhammer's input, who has provided the paper on another issue, counterterrorism measures, and which impact they have on development and humanitarian assistance inside Syria. And in her paper, as Lena will detail to us in a few minutes, She will outline that terror measures can rather strengthen so-called terrorist groups they aim to target. And for example, they can improve their position in humanitarian negotiations and weaken access for humanitarian aid workers. So another key issue to look at if a change of strategy is needed, and both issues surely going well beyond Syria crisis, given that today 80% of humanitarian assistance is provided in conflict settings. And so we need a strategy to have principled humanitarian assistance and a sound political approach at the same time in such settings. However, in the first place, we believe it's important to recall how did this situation evolve? How did the Western countries end up in a situation where they have so little leverage, apparently, to influence developments inside Syria to support democratic forces or opposition forces overall? And how did these dilemmas involve, and that we have to discuss all these trade-offs and these more or less bad or worse options for the way forward. For this, we are very proud to have Carsten Wieland with us. He's a key Syria expert. He's been the senior advisor to 3 UN envoys for the Syria crisis. He's just publishing a book on the so-called neutrality trap for providing assistance inside Syria. And he's a senior advisor of the Green Parliamentary Group in the German Bundestag today, while speaking today on personal capacity. So let's start with Carsten, who can provide the big picture where we stand today, and tell us a bit, Carsten, how did this political deadlock evolve, leaving so limited leverage for influencing developments inside Syria, and the political process, which is not really progressing on any front. Over to you, Carsten, for a couple of minutes, and then we will start a hopefully very interactive session. Thank you, Carsten.
Thank you very much, Ralf, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, a difficult opportunity to outline the Syria crisis in a few minutes, and that's why I would like to focus on very few key issues. I mean, first of all, although it might be a truism to some, but to some it might still be recalled that the Syria crisis that we are facing now has its origin in the Arab Spring, and it is still a legacy from the Arab Spring, although each country took a different course. And the Syrian scenario is probably one of the worst courses and worst outcomes of the Arab Spring, but as a historical chapter and as upheaval that went regional, the universal themes of freedom, dignity, and justice, and absence of corruption, and so on, I think is still very important. Syria was the only non-Western aligned state in the Arab world that was caught by the Arab Spring, and also interesting to note, and Assad felt that, of course, this wave of discontent would not reach him because he felt himself kind of in line with the ruled, and the ruled would be in line with the rulers. But in the end, it was not the case. I mean, with a strong insistence of his mother and other family members, Bashar al-Assad opted for an uncompromising security solution to save his family's dynasty. But in the end, he destroyed his father's legacy. And he will never rule Syria as his father was able to. And we have a lot of different actors on the ground. I mean, this escalation of violence triggered a lasting change of the entire region. From the very beginning, the developments in Syria were highly blended with regional international interests. There were lots of theaters playing in Syria, too difficult to go into detail right now. But at the end also, Syria was the country, the state in the Arab world through which the Russians found their way back into the Middle East after the Arab Spring, where they were looking for partners. And since the Arab Street, in that sense, wanted democracy and were rather looking westwards, the Russians kind of lost out during the Arab Spring, the first months and years, and came back through Syria. And of course, their engagement in Syria was also trying to find an eye-level engagement with the US and getting out of the quagmire of the Ukraine crisis, etc. But the upheaval itself was, of course, cross-cutting the Syrian society, all religions. It had the Arab Spring and also the Syrian upheaval had nothing to do with religion, not even with ideology in the beginning, and it was non-sectarian. Everything else that followed, now we have a lot of other conflicts in that conflict. Everything else that followed was exposed, and it's something that developed out of this conflict. And we, as we might remember, in the first months of this conflict, the people who went to the streets didn't even demand Assad's resignation. They just focused on the lower levels of the state to criticize their corruption and whatever they did with the population, including torture, etc. What we also should have in mind when we look also later on in the discussion towards the humanitarian options and beyond, that we have a leader in Syria who has never proven to show any political courage or vision, neither in the peaceful times nor in the crisis times, until today. Otherwise, also, he would have used the Western readiness. In fact, a lot of countries in Europe and in the Western world in general are interested in investing in reconstruction and relief. At least he would have needed to deliver some change of tone or at least some minor concessions or reforms, but he was not ready to do it. And his obstinacy has caused great damage to the Syrian people, and in the end also, in fact, to his allies, because he is known in Russia and probably also in Iran as a high maintenance ally, somebody who costs a lot of effort to keep him in power. Now, I would like to end the second half of my speech with 4 key headlines, because it is very complex. I just want to summarize it in key features of the conflict: asymmetry, fragmentation, bilateralization, and depoliticization. So what do I mean by all this? First of all, this conflict has shown a great asymmetry of resources and weapons. Especially air power had a devastating influence in this conflict, and also caused a lot of humanitarian suffering. Chemical weapons, etc., were all mostly, I mean, also the weaponry, the heavy weaponry, were all on the government side. It was it has been an asymmetry of alliances, very committed, strong regional, international allies on one side, which is Damascus, while the Western camp was, pleading, calling, appealing, but showed a lot of hesitation, no coherent policy, fear of involvement, and no appetite to repeat things or errors like in Libya or in Iraq. So the principle of responsibility to protect, in fact, was buried under the Syrian rubble. There was an asymmetry of destruction and of victims. When we look at the facts and figures from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, who have kept a quite coherent record, like 88% were killed of civilians were killed by the Syrian regime and Iranian militias on the ground, plus 3% by the Russian forces, and about 2% by the Islamic State, if you want to compare that. The cases of torture were done almost 99% by the Syrian government and its wider regime, the Mukhabarat and militias, etc. Most of the medical personnel were killed by the government and journalists as well. So that's the asymmetry of the entire conflict. Now, fragmentation, number 2. We have a lot of sub-conflicts, and we are actually not facing the original conflict any longer, which was regime against population, so to speak, or large parts of the population. Now, after this militarization and conflict escalation, we are seeing also, Arab-Kurdish cleavage, Shia-Sunni, Kurdish, intra-Kurdish, Turkish-Kurdish. Now we have the whole regional scenario and international problems, all in an agglomeration in Syria. The list of sub-conflicts could be prolonged, in fact. Nowadays, more visible, you can see the Israeli-Iranian file or problem also playing out on Syrian soil with airstrikes, sometimes Russia as a mediator in between, as we saw also with prisoners exchanges, and of course, Turkey somewhere there. Now, this fragmentation is also a fragmentation of actors. Actually, I remember in 2014, when we were thinking of ending or prolonging the Syrian political talks in Geneva, I told to Lahta Brahimi, I said, if we are stopping now, it will be the last time that we are talking about Syria as a whole. And in fact, a few months later, we had another actor coming into Syria, literally outside of all of our political mandates and frameworks, which was the Islamic State, and it kept crumbling and fragmenting. Now, as a consequence, also the territory is fragmented in Syria, highly fragmented. It makes it much more difficult also to find a humanitarian coherent approach, and the fragmentation of diplomacy even and negotiation venues. On the one hand, UN process in Geneva, the Astana process in Astana or Nur Sultan today, and even a possible exportation or spillover of the Astana model, basically Russia and Turkey solving problems in the region, perhaps in Libya and elsewhere. Now, this leads me directly to the third one, which is bilateralization. So the way of solving this conflict was more and more seen as, a bilateral dealing of power and interests, national interests. So it was short-term deals instead of the interest of a comprehensive and multilateral approach and peace effort. And now we can only hope with the new administration in the US that we will have some more multilateral approaches again. And I close with depoliticization, which probably leads us or builds the bridge to the other speakers. So there is an apparent, or the claim that some of these issues are actually unpolitical. They're actually technocratic by nature, and so we have to discuss them in a technocratic way. For example, the famous RRR question, reconstruction, return of refugees, and the third R, what is it? Is it reform or is it something else? But all of this is actually linked into the political problem. It's a chicken egg question also, who moves first, similar to what we are facing right now between the US and Iran when it comes to the nuclear agreement, JCPOA, who moves first and where is an entry point, and I really know what I'm talking about. There have been a lot of suggestions on whatever you call it, step by step, more for more, trying tit for tat, to get out of this quagmire, this dead end, and to try to find entry points of incentives to change things to the better for the Syrian people, in fact. Because the question is, if you pretend, as the Russian narrative tried to pretend with the Sochi Congress and afterwards, that this is a normal country, now we can go into reconstruction right away without any political change, you will have a Syria where half of the population can either not return or not live in peace or without the fear to be captured, tortured, or to disappear. Is that a Syria that we want to reconstruct with Western money? I don't know. So this is, the problem is that this is not a merely technocratic problem. Of course, we need new approaches, and I'm also curious to hear what the other speakers say, but there is still remains the quagmire, the dilemma, how to link this to a political process at the UN, in Geneva or elsewhere, perhaps with a core group of supporters to proceed in parallel to find a longer term solution to the Syrian crisis and the humanitarian crisis and the education crisis and whatever we face in Syria. And that's how I would like to end, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Carsten, for sharing the indeed terribly complex picture of this crisis over the course of the past 10 years and until today. Maybe following up with one question, is it a fair conclusion? Some critics say, well, all the approaches, all the initiatives, for example, by Western countries have been harmed and not that fruitful, given that the overriding objective of them might not have been really peace in Syria, while of course they aimed at peace as well, but the key motivation have been driven by geopolitics. Is this something you would consider a fair judgment, as it would lead us also to Rim's presentation and the argument, why didn't sanction regimes really work? Is that a fair judgment if you could put it in one phrase?
Well, I think it was the opposite. I mean, if the Western countries had acted in a geopolitical strategic manner, they would have acted completely different. I mean, if we look at the chronology again, a few months or few weeks before the upheaval started, the US just established diplomatic relations again with Syria and sent Robert Ford as an ambassador to Damascus. It was Hillary Clinton, state secretary, foreign minister at that time, who said Assad is a reformer. And they were still actually, it was a wishful thinking almost, was sending appeals to Damascus to stop killing unarmed people in the street who were protesting. So that was the first stage, the very first stage. And that was absolutely rather untypical for especially the US, who has shown a lot of, military engagement under George W. Bush, etc. And suddenly, things got worse and worse. And if the West had known, it would trigger the worst refugee crisis so far, which would then influence even domestic politics in Europe, etc. A geopolitical approach would have meant a consequential policy, maybe even some form. I'm not talking about boots on the ground necessarily. There are many other, possibilities, some form of intervention. It was, in fact, human rights oriented in the first place, the very first stage. Now, I would say the second stage, which is often taken as the first stage, I think it's not. The second stage then, when it became radicalized and militarized, was regime change. And you can criticize that because there were no follow-ups. It was also just words. The third phase is actually behavior change of the regime. That's what, the US administration reframed it. But I think the fourth stage, this is what we are in now, is actually cluelessness. And so what are we doing with this conflict and with these gap of education of the future generations in that area and the humanitarian disaster on all sides, on the loyalist side, so-called loyalist side inside Syria under Assad rule, and on the opposition or whatever you want to call it in different actors' sides in other areas in Syria.
Okay, many thanks, Carsten. Surely a very interesting points and something controversially to discuss. Some people might argue geopolitics could also mean that there hasn't been a key interest in the country compared to other countries in the region. And that's why, for example, at some point, the West stepped down. But surely something very openly to discuss. Turkmani is with us. We are very happy to have you on our panel. First of all, it's always key if we talk about Syria to let Syrian people speak. At the same time, you're a top academic. You have published a series of studies on Syria. You are research director at the London School of Economics, co-founder of the Syrian Civil Coalition. And you've published a study on the impact of sanction regimes, looking in a very pragmatic way on the pros and cons and what has come out of it. Did it really incentive change and behavior change of the Syrian government? How did it impact the economy and the independent business of the Syrian government and the current humanitarian situation in the country? So we are very curious to hear what came out of your study. It's from the London School of Economics, as mentioned, can also show it here, brand new and really worth a read. So over to you, Rim.
Thank you so much, Ralf. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, before I step into talking about sanctions, let me just quickly revisit the political position of the sanctioning countries, that's mainly the Europe and the US, towards Syria. They simply overpromised and underdelivered. Yeah, so the promise was the regime change. It came only 3-4 months after the start of the Syrian uprising. They were already talking about regime change, which they were unable to deliver. I'm not going to go here into why, and I mean, Carsten covered this, but there was misalignment between what you say and what you deliver. And I think the sanctions came in here to fill this gap. They were used to fill this gap. Sanctions usually only can be used as a complementary tool in a policy or a strategy. They cannot be used as the main tool to achieve a particular aim, especially if it's of the scale of regime change. We don't know of a case where regimes were changed because of sanctions. Even the South Africa examples, many people attributed other factors that helped the change in South Africa, not only sanctions. So in the case of Syria, the sanctions did not deliver what they wanted, which is neither regime change nor the change of behavior. Yeah, so even on just changing behavior, for ending the brutal killing of civilians in the street, that did not change by the sanctions. Now, they were making based on certain assumptions. One of these assumptions that this crisis is not going to last so long. No one, I mean, few people back then thought we're going to be where we are 10 years on. People thought this may end quickly. Egypt, Tunisia, no one saw this lasting so long. I think if they did, they probably would have reconsidered their approach. Now, the regime was ready. I mean, the regime is not new to sanctions. You know, there were other US and European sanctions that were imposed on Syria since 1979. So they were prepared. They had no assets or investments in the West. They were familiar with all the techniques you need to circumvent sanctions. And also they were able to quickly reconnect with their external, with the external world and with the financial market through proxies and through their allies. Some of them are sanctioning themselves, like Iran and Russia. So, and the regime was able to just deplete the resources quickly. So it started running out of the resources, partially because of sanctions. So it started a process of redistributing the resources, right? And that, as I said, that is partially because of the sanctions. Now, it's important, I think, to make a point regarding sanctions from the outset, that there isn't one analysis or one solution that fits all in the sanctions. You can't put them all in one pot. I mean, you can't compare sanctions against individuals who committed crimes or against security institutions, for example, to sanctions against institutions like the cotton factory or the tobacco factory, which employs tens of thousands of ordinary people, right? So they're not all in the same basket. Some of them did cause real harm to the regime. They had desirable income, but many others had different impact, which is why we adopted in the study this multi-actor, multi-phase methodology, which was developed by the lead author, my colleague, Zaki Mahshi, which I can't summarize this in a very, very short presentation, but if you help me go into the first slide, I'll try to just visualize the changes that came with the sanctions, and stressing this was not only caused by the sanctions. There were many other conflict-related factors of the regime policies. There is violence itself, but we try here to highlight where sanctions impact was really predominant. So start from, this is phase one, the slide that shows you the main actors, whether those who impose sanctions or affected by it, and then in the middle, the Syrian government actors. Towards the bottom is the ordinary people and their businesses. So this is like towards the beginning of the conflict, there was strong, as you see this green arrows, this is like multi-interest. There was strong relationship with Turkey, with the Arab countries, with Europe, reasonable one with the US, very small one with Iran and Russia. This is like trade relations we're talking about. And let's remember that with these trade relations and diplomatic relations comes conditionality, comes lots of strings, right? And back then there was already an agreement being negotiated with the regime, association agreement between the regime and the European Union, and it had all the strings we wanted to put Syria in a better track, but that was all interrupted 10 years ago. You can see here the relations, like the black ones are the coercive relations. You know, mainly we have the security and military actors have imposed coercive relation on the ordinary Syrian businesses, and also they control elements of the government, as in like the government institution, the ministry, under the ministries. I'm not talking about the whole regime. They had their cronies associated with them, but even those cronies, they didn't have that important role that they play on now. If you go to the next slide, 10 years on, and after really very long, complicated process, you can see first how the relationship with the outside world changed. The one with Turkey, like particularly the Arab world, Europe, US, they just disappeared, they're gone. The one with Iran and Russia have now increased. And what is worse is that the Iran and Russia, the external actors, now they have a coercive relation with the regime. Now they control the regime far more than before, because they know all the other doors are closed. So there's only this one. The sanctions were not universal, right? So this is the only exit. This is your, Iran gave a lifeline to the regime through the credit line. Russia gives it, access to the international market or oil. I mean, they have very complex relationships. So the dependency increased, and with it came politics. And this is one reason, not all, why it's so difficult now for the West to take Syria out of the Russian jaw. The relationship inside, you can see, became more complex. The cronies are now playing different role, because those at the bottom, the ordinary Syrians, the small businesses, the corner shop, the small workshop, the small factories, the new medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, these were severely damaged by the sanction, severely. Like, you cannot import and transport anymore. You're cut off from the rest of the world. But who can afford to circumvent the sanctions, to have relations with international lawyers, with international companies, with shadows? It's the big guys, right? So this is why the cronies, their companies, their institutes became far more important. The little ones were killed, which means now we give monopoly to the worst actors, right? So if you want to go now and get anything done in Syria, you have no way but to go to those big hawks who are very closely linked with the regime. I think you can take away this slide here. So what I want to say here is a new environment was created, right, as a result of sanctions and other actors. But sanctions were clearly a big contributor to this, especially the sanctions on the financial institutions. So Carsten was wondering now, okay, do we want to do reconstruction now? And what does that mean? We're going to be helping the regime. I agree with him. If within this corrupt structure that we have right now in Syria, which is far worse than what we had 10 years ago, any money you pour on the structure will be directed to the wrong people, will be going to these big guys. If you want to build anything, there isn't only these big cronies associated with the regime will be able to deliver. Yeah? Even in the old days, they used to contract the kind of middle level. This middle level is gone, right? So yeah, I agree. It's not time for, okay, let's go back to where we were before 2011. Because this is not a linear process. It's a very non-linear process, which what that means is you cannot just say, okay, let's lift the sanctions and everything will go back to 2011. It's not the case, yeah. So you have to have a different approach, and the sanctions certainly need to be an important part of this approach. And again, there isn't one solution fits all for the sanctions. So what we really think right now is that there is a need indeed for a whole new strategy towards Syria. The economic element needs to be a very important part of this strategy to transform the economy from this conflict economy that gives space to all these corrupt actors to an economy that is more productive. So you can support the productive sector, the agricultural sector, for example, which is a very safe sector to support the SMEs. So give space to the layer that benefit the ordinary people, the small businesses, which is really the guys who are connected to the regime. They don't like small businesses. This is not their arena. So support the arena that helps ordinary people, helps the economy to recover in a legitimate way. It gives power and agency to the people who shouldn't be just recipients of humanitarian aid. Have such a strategy, and then sanctions can be the complementary element that you can use in this strategy. You shouldn't lift them all or keep them all. The different approach, some maybe need to be strengthened, other need to be revisited or changed. For other, you may have to create different institutions to or say parallel mechanisms to minimize their damage or to access the actors who you cannot access right now. There are other elements, other economic elements should be part of the strategy. For example, the support aid or the aid policy that goes into Syria that can also be used as part of economic transformation. But to keep going on like we are right now, when the aid money is drying out, when the Syrians are on the brink of starvation, and we're even like the upper middle class are starving. So just can you imagine what's happening lower down the scale, right? We just cannot continue treating Syria as if it's an earthquake. And when we run out of things to do, just impose more sanctions. Certainly it's time for a new approach. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rim. Maybe following up with two quick questions. One, maybe let's focus for a minute again on the impact of the sanctions. And if we can go back to the second graph, maybe in a minute. Would you agree, there is another brand new study just published a few days ago by Impact. They highlight in a new study how sanctions have harmed humanitarian assistance, NGOs, civil society inside Syria by over-compliance to sanctions, by financial transactions being almost impossible to fund projects to support assistance. Would you agree that this is a major impact? If you look at your second graph on the bottom right, the minus and the brackets is the impact outlined versus the pluses. So NGOs, households, civil business are mostly harmed by the sanctions, while the crownies at the right are mostly benefiting from it. So would you agree that especially on the side of civil society and NGOs you mentioned?
I fully agree. I mean, they severely harm the civilians. And I'll give you, I agree with all the studies, the example they cited, like civil society, NGOs, but I'll give you another example. One way the Syrians are surviving is really through remittance. One of the major income now for most Syrians is the remittance. For this incredible networks of Syrians abroad, they're all sending 50 euro, 100 euro, 200 euro, whatever, to their counterparts inside the country. And this is what keeps the Syrians afloat right now, okay? This is a very efficient way to help because it's very well targeted, no waste through international salaries and overheads, We just can't do this anymore, partially because of the sanctions. You can't transfer anything to Syria. You know, I can't help anyone I know, my friends in Syria, because of the sanctions. I mean, yesterday, somebody called me here, a Syrian who lived here for a long time, and she and her husband were applying for a mortgage, right? And the bank told them, they are Syrians, originally Syrian British, and the bank told them, sorry, we can't give you a mortgage because you have sent money, remittance, and this we're talking about very, very small amount. You have sent money to Syria. And if you want a mortgage, stop sending money. The lady said, I was sending money to my father. He was having an operation. I said, no, if you want to help your father, you don't get a mortgage. So imagine if somebody living here was affected. How about those on the ground?
And of course, the key question talking about Syria is always about the alternatives. So what could be a better solution or a less bad one? So you propose in your study a meso-level approach and, for example, channeling funding for programs for civil society by trust funds. Maybe you could add, invest one more minute on what you are thinking of, while we surely discuss in further detail later on.
Look, I think sanctions, funds of all sorts, they are a room to have leverage now, to change. For the Europeans, this is probably the only leverage. We can't talk about much more. They don't have boots on the ground. They're not going to intervene militarily. This is their entry point, right? So the question is, what conditionality can you attach to this that can change this situation? If you keep it very, very high up, very like grand, I don't see anything changing, right? So let's forget at the top level for a minute, but I think eventually there will be change. It's gonna come, but I mean, let's start from a different level and have strings on the level that you can really achieve change. I mean, don't just go high up straight away. So you can attach different conditionality. It could be around ways to help civil society, independent businesses, help recover the economy on as I said, on the lower level that is closer to the people. For that, I think the regime will always have a side interest in this. Let's say, for example, you find a new mechanism now, a benign mechanism, where you help Syrians to send remittance to their counterparts inside Syria. It's the ordinary people who will benefit the most. the regime will have a side interest that, well, then there will be more hard currency going on, so the exchange rate will go down a little bit, right? But fine, that will give it an incentive to engage in such talks. Again, if we envisage new mechanisms to support civil society, support small businesses, small farms, small workshops, small factories. If we support such trust fund, negotiate a mechanism to implement it for the money to reach the right people, have the right vetting process, that could be something that is doable and that can help ordinary people and give them agency. Because right now, I mean, I get asked the question often like, do you expect now because of the economic collapse, people are gonna revolt against the regime? Really? I mean, do you think people who just can't even feed their children, they have time to think about politics? Mm-hmm. Even if they burst, that will not be the burst that you have in mind. It will be complete breakdown of law and order. That what comes with prolonged period of economic distress. We've seen this in Venezuela. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, right? You don't get a democratic revolution with that. If you want democratic transition, give people agency, give them help. And that agency doesn't just come with pure humanitarian aid.
Okay. Thank you, Rim. We surely will discuss further details on the sanction regimes over the course of the next 45 minutes and let also Carsten react to your proposals. Let's quickly move on to the second topic of our debate today in the paper Lena Schellhammer has published via CHAR. And again, we are very grateful for this input. Lena is working with Maram Foundation, a Syrian NGO, and joins us from Gaziantep in Turkey. She has published a study which is called Breaking the Silence. It calls for a different approach vis-a-vis counter-terrorism measures as they might strengthen the ones they're supposed to target, so-called terrorist groups, as they might worsen the negotiation position of humanitarian actors, for example, in northwest Syria, and as these impacts might go well beyond the Syria crisis. So Lena, you speak today as an academic to us. That's important to note. It's a sensitive topic and we all speak on personal capacity. What have been the findings of your study? Over to you, Lena.
Thank you, Ralf, and welcome everybody. Yes, I want to highlight this in the beginning. I did this study in 2019, so before I started working with Maram Foundation. So it's not representing Maram, it's representing the humanitarian community here, or my results from the study. So I assume that most of the humanitarian practitioners who are here with us today, they know that humanitarian negotiations with non-state armed groups to ensure provision of humanitarian assistance, to safeguard humanitarian space, or to protect vulnerable groups is often a humanitarian necessity. And but these humanitarian negotiations represent a crucial challenge in the day-to-day working environment of humanitarian actors, and especially if humanitarian access has to be negotiated with designated terrorist groups. Because if access has to be negotiated with the terrorist groups, humanitarian actors have to navigate a legal gray area because of the counterterrorism legislation. This problem or dilemma is not new since counterterrorism legislation goes back to 2001. And after the attacks of 9/11, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373 marked the cornerstone of the current counterterrorism legislation. And they intend, or the resolution intend to combat and counterterrorism by preventing and suppressing the financial support to designated terrorist groups. But the crucial thing about this resolution is that it was adopted without including an objective and internationally accepted definition of terrorism. That means each state is designating armed groups as terrorist groups according to their agenda and to their objectives. So there's no objective definition on the term. And but this arbitrary designation of certain non-state armed groups by governments has significant impact on the working environment of humanitarians. for instance, that the provision of training or expert advice, assistance, personnel, or transportation might be framed as providing direct or indirect support to terrorist groups. And based on the country, the consequences could be fines, imprisonment, or sanctions. This depending on the country from which is funding the project or the NGO. So it depends on the respective country how to deal with counterterrorism legislation and how this is implemented in actions. So looking now into the case study of northwestern Syria, and Lena, could you please go back one slide so we can see also the map? Yes, thank you. So as we heard already, Syria is now in its 11th year of conflict and represents a challenging working environment for humanitarians. Carsten mentioned already we have different conflicts in Syria ongoing, and the study, and I focused on northwestern Syria, and this is the map is from 2019, where we can see the violence, the intensity of violence between armed groups and pro-government groups in the army. So yeah, the Syrian conflict is representing a challenging working environment because we have, especially in the beginning, a high amount of different non-state armed groups. At the same time, 11.1 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So it is clear that somehow interaction has to be taking place to ensure humanitarian assistance. And especially in northwestern Syria, in Idlib governorate, that is controlled by Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is a designated terrorist group, not only by the Syrian government, but also by the US, Turkey, and UN. Humanitarians have to, on the one side, have the dilemma to ensure and maintain humanitarian access on the ground, but at the same time to comply or to go align with counterterrorism legislation of not supporting a terrorist group. So in northwestern Syria, we have 4 million people living there. Of them, more than half of them are in need of humanitarian assistance in 2019, but still up to date. So interactions with HTS is necessary, even though it is not permitted under counterterrorism legislation. So in my study and in my paper that is now published by the CHA, I showcase these humanitarian access negotiations with HTS and its local governance institution, the Syrian Salvation Government. And by interviewing 17 humanitarian actors working for local NGOs, INGOs, but also international agencies, and then by analyzing the data using the micropolitics theory of Crozier and Friedberg and the theory of power dependence by Emerson, I pointed out the implications of counterterrorism measures on the humanitarians' ability to pursue the negotiations. And it became clear that there are huge or significant impact on the ability of humanitarians to ensure humanitarian access on the ground. So according to these theories, humanitarian negotiations are not, or imply not, a set of interactions or transactions between conflict parties. They emphasize more that it's a power relation among them. And in order to analyze this power relation, I focused on the negotiation environment, the participating actors, their objectives and strategies, as well as leverages. So you can go one slide ahead, Lena. Yes, perfect. So here you can see the overall objective and then the objective of HTS versus the humanitarian actor. So not only because we have a high number of people in need in Idlib governorate, humanitarians have to interact with HTS or the Salvation Government, but also based on the theory, it's clear that no party can achieve the objectives independently. So each party must view the other as having a shared role and a shared responsibility in reaching an agreed outcome. So here we see we have an overall objective, which HTS and the humanitarian actor both share, but within they have individual objectives, and they have to negotiate and interact in order to reach their individual objectives and then the overall objective. So, but due to the accusation of being the extended arm of the terrorist network Al-Qaeda, HTS has been designated as a terrorist group in May 2018 by the US and Turkey, among other states. And since then, a culture of silence emerged around negotiation activities. And because in the beginning, when HTS started to gain more control on the ground, humanitarian actors welcomed this development, because before we had hundreds of different non-state armed groups, and then it was only one group that is present, and we only have to interact with one group. But after the designation as a terrorist group, NGOs refrain from officially saying we'll interact with HTS, even though it is clear for nearly everyone that these interactions have to take place to not only ensure and maintain access, but also to safeguard the humanitarian space and the staff on the ground and the projects. So yeah, the result is that due to the absence of an open dialogue and among humanitarian actors on access negotiations and their strategies, a culture of silence emerged. And instead of communication and cooperation, humanitarians go for secretly gained individual wins. So humanitarians choose alternative approaches to cope with the counterterrorism measures, which are mostly short-sighted and entail a variety of dilemmas. For instance, if they're involving intermediaries like local councils. And could you please go for the next slide? Yes, thank you. So we have the example of local councils that can be involved as intermediary, because the dilemma is that direct interactions or direct negotiations are not allowed under counterterrorism legislation. So when humanitarian actors choose intermediaries like local councils, they enter legal negotiations, and at the same time, they have a third actor with own objectives into negotiations. And this third actor is mostly not as neutral as perceived. So instead, this actor might be, or most likely is, aligned with HTS voluntarily or by force. So even though intermediaries enable indirect negotiations, they have a limited positive effect for humanitarian actors. It highly depends on the objectives of the intermediary itself and how they are aligned with HTS or the Salvation Government. And since HTS and the Salvation Government knows about this, this is very prone to be misused by HTS in order to decide this power relation in their favor. And another coping strategies by humanitarian actors, which is also used, is to threaten or even suspend humanitarian operations, because they know that HTS is dependent, as we saw, on the popular support on the ground in order to strengthen its governance project. So they need some of the legitimacy on the ground from the population. So in case the humanitarian actor is threatening or suspending the project, they know that the population is going or pushing against HTS and Salvation Government and holding them accountable for the aid suspension. So this is a strategy to push or to have leverage on HTS, on the Salvation Government. However, this strategy is highly causing enormous, or most likely potentially causing enormous harm to populations in need if humanitarian aid is suspended. So, but these strategies, coping strategies of humanitarian actors remain necessary because of the criminalization of negotiations activities in the framework of the counterterrorism legislation. So also because of the lack of international support and the resulting culture of silence, there's no open or sustained dialogue on these coping strategies, and thus they cannot be, they just continue. And so in other words, governments and donors criminalize the engagement with non-state armed groups that are classified as terrorist groups, although they are aware that engagement with these groups is required to ensure and maintain humanitarian access and to deliver highly needed humanitarian assistance. So the result is that humanitarians often opt for individual, isolated, clandestine, and intransparent negotiations with non-state armed groups like HTS to still deliver on the humanitarian imperative and to pursue their own individual and organizational objective, for instance, the financial survival. So we have this situation not only now, but HTS is designated since 2018 as a terrorist group. And I did my study 2019, and still now these coping strategies are present, and you can monitor them on the ground. So I hope, or what can be done, that there will be a more open and sustained dialogue and discussion, not only on what is happening on the ground, but also to have a joint approach that is also including the donors, especially the donors, because everyone wants to keep the risk away from themselves, but at the end, the local NGOs are the one who have to take the risk because they are the implementing partner on the ground, and they have to interact with HTS or the Salvation government, even though the donors know this unofficially or in informal conversations. They don't want to bear the risk officially. So the risk lies with the local NGOs. And yeah, I hope with my paper to bring more light in this dilemma for local NGOs. And yeah, let's see what it will bring.
Many thanks, Lena. Many thanks for sharing the paper and the key aspects of it in your presentation. Maybe to put it in a nutshell, is it a fair summary to say the objectives of counterterrorism measures to fight, of course, designated terrorist groups, Islamic State, etc., might result in security objectives overriding humanitarian ones, and by that resulting in outcomes which might in some cases be just the opposite of what has been the objective, like strengthening terrorist groups and their negotiation position because of this, for example, intermediary setup in negotiations. And secondly, what does that mean? What donors need to change? Do we talk about a change of counterterrorism measures? And what do NGOs need to change? You also mentioned in your paper strong competition, fundraising race, silence because not to weaken their own position vis-a-vis donors, but also in this race to position yourself. If you can put it like in 1 minute, what would be key changes from these two actors you would hope for?
I think the really key point is the open dialogue that is not only including local NGOs, or field staff must be also included because they are the frontline workers. They interact and negotiate, so they must also be included. But then the local NGOs and INGOs, international agencies, because it's not possible to just change on one side of the problem. It has to be a multilateral approach. And because even though local NGOs change, there's still the competitive environment that is enhanced by the donors who have their criteria, who is getting projects and funding, etc. So local NGOs are competing for humanitarian access on the ground, and without having the support from donors or the environment, they can speak up and maybe share more openly what kind of incidents and problems they face. It's not possible to change. So it's really on both sides at the same time. And also donors have their fear that in case of the media in the home countries or their donors, the local population, the supporting INGOs, if these donors or population would know that they will support a terrorist group, they also fear of their financial survival. So it's in the end affecting everyone, but the risk is currently with the local NGOs because they are the one who are negotiating access.
Thank you. Thanks, Lena. We will go back to Rim for a quick reaction and Carsten. But let me remind you also that all of you are more than welcome to engage in the chat, to raise your comments and your questions, as we will turn to you after a couple of few more minutes with our panelists. So please let us know what you see as key points and what might need to change, if anything at all. Rim, what you heard about counterterrorism measures and their impact, does that sound familiar to you? Is there a linkage, you think, between sanction regimes, counterterrorism measures, the risk transfer to especially local actors, especially minor NGOs who don't have big compliance units and suffer the most from regulations which are supposed to support the sector in Syria? Does that sound familiar? And would you agree with Lena that there is a need for action on both sides?
I fully agree with her. I'm not surprised with the finding. We hear about them every day on the ground. A couple of years ago, one of my colleagues at the LSE, Professor David Keane, conducted a study on the same topic. It's called Playing into Their Hands. And his conclusion was also that these measures are really, really playing into the terrorist hands. And I went with him to the Washington to lobby on this issue. We spoke to the National Security Council, and there's no response. I mean, these measures are there, and they're not going to change. At the same time, you see other measures by the same community, the same actors on other parts of Syria that are in many ways, they are actually promoting terrorism. Yeah, so I'm referring here, for example, to the situation in the Northeast, the way things are governed, the corruption, the exclusion in some areas, let's say Raqqa, for example, the way the people of Raqqa are excluded from really being the decision maker in the destiny of their own city. They're marginalized. The division, the Arabic Kurdish division, is creating excellent environment for terrorism. Yeah, and this is supported and legitimized by the Americans. The income of the oil now is feeding a war economy and all corrupt actors, including terrorist one in the region. This is all under this, the eye of the Americans, and they're hardly doing anything about it. So we feel so frustrated when we see terrorism growing in one part of the country, and then counterterrorism actually making life so difficult for people in another part.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Rim. Carsten, going back to you, what you heard about counterterrorism measures and sanction regimes sounds like a call for a substantial change of approach, not like adjusting sanctions here and there or making them a tiny bit more targeted, but like going back, for example, to phase one when they have been targeting the elite personal sanctions, but maybe ending where possible the really broad economic ones, which one might argue are rather escalating the suffering of the people. Is there a need for substantial change? And if so, how would that look like from your view?
Well, I think that I agree with Reem also in the sense that sanctions must be part of a toolkit, right? They must be complementary and no compensation for policy, for a comprehensive policy. And if you talk about, when you talk about change and necessary change, the dead end has been reached because there were not really consistent policies. But on the other hand, when it comes to sanctions themselves, yes, I see them as a compensation right now, but on the other hand, they have become much more targeted individual sanctions. So as also Reem said, we have to distinguish between, different kinds of sanctions. And I think sanctions have to be individual right now because we have seen the economic impact, but also sanctions do hurt. That's why the Russian side, the Syrian government side, etc., keep repeating them as the ones that have to be lifted and then come to negotiations with sanctions first on their mind. So there is something about sanctions that really makes them uneasy, and so it is also something that can be lifted and make them easy. You know what I mean? So it is something that can be of transactional value. But so far we haven't seen any transaction because there was no movement. We have a dead end. So I think, first of all, sanctions have to be targeted, and I think individual sanctions to the persons who are actually on a very soft cushion throughout all these times. When we see Assad's mother, who was so hardcore in fighting the people in the streets, she died in Dubai, and she was there for many years. And also Assad's advisor, Hussein Shaban, said the Syrian economy is much better than before 2011. I mean, the cynicism is appalling. And so if you target these kind of individuals, that's different. And then they have to be transparent. People need to understand why sanctions are imposed, both, by the way, in Syria as in Europe. Where the people also need to understand what is our government doing here? Why do we impose these sanctions? I think that even sometimes I hear from European diplomats that sanctions could be better explained. So I think we have also many ways of improving the system and adjusting, but they will not be successful in being the only compensation for a real comprehensive policy. The political process, diplomacy, etc., needs to be not given up upon, although this is also in a stalemate, but that's another issue. So it needs to be a package. And in this package, I think the sanctions do make sense. And also we have to remember, when they come, the Syrian side and the Russians come to negotiation and say, the sanctions are the problem. The hospitals and the medical facilities were not destroyed by sanctions in the first place. They were destroyed by Assad himself. And so not all, which is now going down the drain economically, health-wise, when it comes to COVID, etc., is a consequence of sanctions. It's rather a consequence of uncompromising security solution policy, what it deliberately chose as his defense against civil protests.
Ralf, can I come in here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to challenge Carsten on the last comment on the hospitals, right? Yes, the regime directly targeted hospitals, reduced them to the ground, right? But there's a large number of hospitals across Syria. Many of them are still functioning, right? In Homs, Damascus, Aleppo, all the areas under government control, many, if not most, of the medical equipments like X-rays, MRIs, in these hospitals are actually from Europe, right? And many of them are now stuck. They don't work because they can't do the software upgrade because of the sanction. They can't get the accessories. They can't get the materials they need to run them because of the sanctions. And I'll give you a personal example. My mother last year was for 3 weeks in intensive care in the top hospitals in Damascus, right? That really the most, the one where the president goes if something goes wrong to him. And she had to be transferred from one place to the other because the machine doesn't work here or not there. And then at some point, my father had to rent one of the equipments from another hospital and bring it to her because the one at this hospital will not work. It's a daily issue. My mother was even transferred from Homs to Aleppo in ambulance, to Damascus, sorry, in ambulance, because all the machines in Homs did not work. This is not fair. There are ordinary people dying and suffering because of this. The narrative that it's only the regime. I'm so much against the regime. I think everyone knows that. But this just doesn't help the Syrians anymore to keep the attention only in the regime and hoping this will change things. We need the way, for example, you ask what we do. Can we find a solution to all these medical equipments across the country to help the people?
I understand that point. As far as I'm informed, at least, I'm not an expert in all the details of the sanctions. What I understand from my European colleagues is that the medical, equipment and also medical substances, chemicals, etc., what you need, medicine. Once also the government in the beginning of the COVID crisis presented a list. They said, we don't get all this, medicine. All the substances, almost except one, that were on this list were all exempted from sanctions. So the sanctions don't target medical facilities, neither medicine, but we have, of course, a problem of overcompliance. That's also something that we see in Iran, where especially under the Trump administration, where all the private enterprises were afraid of doing any kind of deals with that country because they were fearing to be targeted don't have any possibility to do any business with the US and other states anymore. So over compliance is a problem. That's why transparency is a problem. And I do see, and also the question is, of course, when Russia and China in the Security Council support Assad, of course, they're European machines, but on the other hand, you know, on the first hand, we need to know, is that all because of sanctions, or is it of overcompliance, or is it of mismanagement of the regime itself? And the fourth question would be, aren't there Chinese machines and Russian machines who could, you know, why don't they deliver these machines? Do they want to limelight, to spotlight these problems, also to blame the sanctions of the West only for the situation? You know, I think it's a complex situation, and I do agree, and especially if you have these individual cases, it's appalling how people are suffering from individual problems caused by, and that's why I'm saying, you know, we have to check sanctions, mismanagement, you know, overcompliance, etc. But I think we have to look into it.
Can I come to this, Ralf?
Please.
Important point. Yes, there is an overcompliance. He's absolutely right. The sanctions don't particularly target the medical or any humanitarian kind of sector, but the sanctions are not new. They've been, you know, they've been tried in every country before, and everyone knows that sanctions on the financial sector will mean immediately that no one would ever do any transaction with this country. Like if my friend wasn't able to help her father for an operation because of the sanctions, which company in Europe would ever dare to do any transaction? For what cost? Of course they will not. This is known. And we've been talking about this for years and years, and no one is ready to even provide the solution to this problem in particular. Yes, they can go to China, but they cannot, who can afford replacing the whole, you know, equipment, everyone in the country overnight, right? And yes, now many are going to China and Russia, but is this what we want? With this trade relation, as I said, comes leverage, comes ability to change things. Why to lose this? Why to give it as a present to Russia and China? I don't understand.
I agree. I mean, that's a political question in the end as well, about influence in the country in the long term.
Maybe quickly summarizing it, Carsten, I guess there is a different point of view that you would still have hopes. I mean, nobody of us would disagree that there is huge human suffering, and really, we very much hope your mom is fine now. Everybody would agree there's a great trade-off and a terrible dilemma on the humanitarian side. But Carsten, I understand from your view that you still have hopes that in the medium term or long run, sanctions, maybe slightly adjusted, sanctions including some sort of package with other incentives could change the overall situation. Is that a fair summary of your point of view?
That's a bit short. Well, I think, as I said, sanctions as a part of an overall toolkit. What I do think is that perhaps also the political process, the negotiations, if at all, they will resume again, because now we have to remind ourselves we are talking about, if we talk about the Geneva talks, now we are only discussing constitution. That's one of four main issues of the UN mandate. So I think sanctions, how to adjust them through a successful political process, should be part of the deliberations and strategy of the UN process as well. You know, you should link up these issues in an overall political approach. And then so far, of course, I mean, the sanctions are done by countries or entities like EU or the US, etc., and not by the UN, of course. But still, I think they could be used also to lift them, as also Reem said. You know, sanctions are there, you know, can be imposed and lifted, and both can have an effect. And the same, like, you know, many issues are outside the political process at the moment. Also detainees, etc. All these humanitarian questions, and these need to be taken back on board in a negotiation process in Geneva.
So maybe in our final round, Carsten, you could share with us a bit your hopes and where you see still leverage for political progress. Well, it seems we are in a stalemate right now. Let me quickly turn to Lena again before we ask my colleague Sonia to share some insights and comments from chat. Lena, as we always talk about, we need to listen much more to the local people and to their representatives, and you work for a Syrian NGO, why you can't speak for it. Listening to this debate, as you are based in Gaziantep, what do you hear? What would be the right way forward Do we need a different approach and being more liberal with sanctions to ease the human suffering in the country, while we might pay a political price for that?
And I just wanted to add one thing to the sanctions. We have to bear in mind that in July this year, the cross-border resolution for the last border crossing in Bab el-Hawa has to be reauthorized, otherwise it will be cancelled. So this would also change the situation on the ground, or the situation for humanitarian assistance. So this have to be also in mind. But for the approach to deal with counterterrorism legislation, and what I can say now from being in Gaziantep and working for a local NGO and being in the environment, it is clear, as I said, with the open dialogue, but also to have same red lines or same decisions on compromises, to avoid that HTS can play off the NGOs against each other by saying, okay, this NGO is giving us a share of 10%, why don't you do this with us? So to have more really the joint approach by the humanitarian community here in Gaziantep to, in the end, have a better negotiation position, to be in the power relation and in a better stance, to then ensure the humanitarian access without compromising, without bilateral deals, without individual decisions that is in the end affecting the whole community, and not only the NGO maybe, but also really the whole.
Thank you, Lena. Now I'd like to turn to my colleague Sonja. We have asked you to engage in the chat. I think most have been a bit shy regarding the sensitive topic, but Sonja will know much better. Over to you.
Thank you, Ralf, indeed. And I wanted to also thank all the panelists for their very thought-provoking inputs and statements. And I think everyone listened attentively and had perhaps no time to write questions yet. We do have one question regarding humanitarian exemptions. We already heard from Carsten the tendency of overcompliance, but the question really is how can it be ensured that these humanitarian exemptions are really working? And I know we talked a lot about sanctions and counterterrorism measures, but as the event today is also sort of a recap 10-year Syria crisis, is it time for a new approach? I also wanted to pose a question to all panelists, Carsten from your political view, Rim with your economic view, but also Lena from your view working directly for a humanitarian NGO on the ground. What could be the new approach to the Syria crisis, perhaps shifting the conversation a bit to that part. With that, over to you, and I encourage everyone to post questions in the chat if you have any.
Many thanks, Sonja. Maybe we start with Lena. Lena, talking about humanitarian exemptions. Wouldn't that be something which should help also on the counterterrorism side? We know that none of them is really easy, straightforward and easygoing for NGOs. Why doesn't it help, for example, in your context regarding Northwest Syria? Isn't that something which should ensure that humanitarians can operate as they need to by this legislation? Somehow it doesn't work. From your experience, what's the key reason for that?
In my opinion, humanitarian exemption would work because it would increase that humanitarian actors can speak openly without having the fear of having fines or imprisonment. And it could be also supporting then the local NGOs in their way of working and having a different way of partnership with donors, and not to like avoid speaking on the hot topic. So just going around and around and try, how do we frame this? How do we write emails to donors? How do we tell that we not interacting with them, but somehow we do? So humanitarian exemptions or in counterterrorism legislations would be a way to, in my opinion, to start this dialogue, because for now, especially in COVID times, we have online meetings, and in online meetings, you don't know who is there, even though you have to register in the beginning. And these are all sensitive topics. So if one NGO is speaking up and sharing incidents or sharing problems on the ground and doesn't know who is listening, what can be the consequences? Most NGOs or humanitarian workers are not actors, are not speaking up, do it then bilaterally with, for instance, the OCHA Access Working Group, but not in public. And this results then that others don't know what others face on the ground. So there can be not common approach regarding HTS when it's not clear for everyone what is happening on the ground. So every NGO has their own problems, incidents, and strategies how to face them. But it's not, currently not possible to really address them to the public.
Mm-hmm. And maybe adding to these crucial points, for example, also on the structural side, I mean, there are a lot of reports also inputting from the operational level, like the financial sector being really restrictive, a lot of dialogues in many countries with the banking sector as over-compliance with sanctions or just perceived sanctions, making the financial sector not transferring funds. NGOs needed to stop projects inside Syria because they simply couldn't transfer funding. So there's surely a key issue we need to deal with.
Only funding, also a salary for staff. How is it transferred inside? What kind of ways does the money has to take to arrive in Idlib, to have the funding for the projects, for the staff, etc.
Right. Rim, you would like to add anything on the topic of humanitarian exemptions and why also on the sanction regime side these are not working? You outlined in your study how the NGO sector, also the local NGO sector inside Syria, is harmed by this.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone can even access humanitarian exemption. You need to be able to communicate with the sanctioning authority and apply, and not all actors have this capacity. Also, this became a new arena where some of the regime cronies are mastering. So to get a humanitarian exemption, for example, let's say to import wheat, you have to have something proves that you already have like a tender or a contract with the government that allows you to import wheat, and then you get the exemption. So there's a whole new kind of operation now. If you go and get fake contracts, you have to pay for this, of course. So you can take it to the sanction authorities, get the exemptions. Now that you have it, you have a value. You go to the regime and say, okay, give me the contract again. So it's not always working the right way. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be, of course, there shouldn't be humanitarian exemption, but maybe they need to look again and the way it's implemented. On the question of like what the new approach, I mean, as I said, right now, the Syrian economy is really in its worst shape since the beginning of the crisis. Everyone I talk to there's a universal answer that is, it's now much more difficult than the highest episodes of violence. Like when there was a real war, it was easier than, the situation now, which is why I think now it's really important time to devise a new strategy for Syria, but with a robust economic component where sanctions are just a complementary constructive tool if they are aligned with other elements, right? So that they can reduce the burden on the Syrian people. With the strategy, I think it should aim at a gradual changes, democratization. Everyone is forgetting democracy. It's a forgotten word. Syrians rose up because they wanted democracy. It doesn't mean you change regime overnight. Democracy can be built from the bottom up. Let's focus on that level. Let's focus on the bottom up. But it doesn't work on its own. I mean, there's lots of debate on top down, bottom up. I would say there is so much done on the top down in Syria. It's very important. We cannot ignore it, but you also have to work from the bottom up and build your structures and support from the bottom up. So far, the support to the bottom has been in terms of humanitarian aid or supporting civil society. That is important, but on its own it's not enough. You need to look at the policies of space. How do you create space for a civil society to be able to breathe and to function? So it kind of gradually introduce change and give people agency.
Many thanks, Rim. Before we start a final round, as we have to finish in a few minutes, let me quickly pick up 2 points in the chat myself. One is on why is the Assad government inadmissible for the Europeans, and the other, so without the sanctions or with low-level sanctions, what could put some pressure on the Assad government or provide incentives, which leads back a bit to the question to share with Carsten, what could be this overall package, which might still help to have some leverage in the Syrian context. Maybe a very quick round, if you can limit yourself to max 2 minutes, that would be great. Carsten, what's your hope? What are your hopes in this terrible crisis for 10 years now? What could still make us progress on the humanitarian situation, but also the political one inside Syria? How could such a package look like?
Well, I think that the overall package, I have the feeling at this point, needs to resolve, first of all, a few issues around Syria before going back into Syria. It sounds off, but I think one of the first steps is a US-Iranian agreement on the JCPOA, which would lead to a better dialogue. It would have effects on Yemen, by the way, as much as it would have an effect perhaps on Syria. The second step, but these are steps that take time, right? Is of course to end the deadlock between the West and Russia. Because also the question, what is there except a full military engagement, which the West will not do for good reasons at the moment in any case, and sanctions only, is of course talking with the allies who also are in need and are interested in finding a solution, because for them it's not a status quo that they would like to live with for years either, not to mention the Syrian people, of course. So I think what we need is some dynamics that will lead to a common sense of this is what we need to resolve this question. And I think also directed to Assad himself, I think he should not misunderstand any political effort, negotiated effort to solve this conflict as another way of, or another means of regime change. I think these times over. The West has not played out its role in this, if that was ever a serious goal. Now it's about political change. And I think this is what we need in order to get the humanitarian and the economic situation back to something like, more acceptable for everyone in all kind of, people in the fractured territory of Syria. So we need, right now, nothing will work and nothing will move in Syria because Assad is waiting for his reconfirmation as the president. I don't call it elections in June. So it's his right to do that as a sovereign, in a sovereign state. You can do whatever you like in your way of reconfirming your political leadership. And then he has that ticked off. And then I think is another window to start and to see where have the other issues that I just talked about in that region developed, and even internationally, where can we find an entry point? Now he's safely back in power. Will the Russians want him to stay another 7 years? That's another big question to pose. If not, then there's something to talk about. If yes, then there's also something to talk about, because we need to improve the situation in Syria itself. And as we all have agreed, I think here that the situation right now is unbearable, but it's also unbearable for Assad himself and the loyalists on his side. And so I think it is a package that involves step-by-step measures now, looking at Syria, waiting until June. Waiting is a bad word in this time, but still the humanitarian relief goes on and has to go on. But on the political side, which could include many more factors that then would be able to capture also reconstruction, other issues, I think this time, this window will open only later after summer.
Thank you, Carsten. Closing with a very pragmatic approach, talking of the US, where Carsten has hopes that the new Biden administration can change the regional setup to some extent, and that might help in the midterm at least vis-a-vis Syria. The US diplomat Feldman has proposed to adjust sanctions substantially and to make them conditionally on more leverage for NGOs to work inside Syria. So sort of a more for more approach, at least on the civil society side, but basically giving up to change behavior or even the political system inside Syria. Is that a pragmatic approach? Do we need to give up that we can do much more than stop suffering from Syrian people by substantially adjusting the sanction regimes?
I think indeed we need a pragmatic approach. Now the Biden administration can do much, but Syria doesn't seem to be at the top of the list of their interest right now. They're very much focused on the Northeast, counterterrorism, but not kind of overall solution to the Syrian crisis. And I think the best thing they can do to help right now is talk to the Russians, find wherever they want to reach consensus, whichever level, I don't know, on Syria. If they agree on something, it's going to move, right? I mean, eventually it will move. But right now, the Russian-American cleavage on Syria is one of the main obstacles. And I really hope they do reach an agreement of some sort.
I agree.
Because I agree with Carsten on the elections. I mean, they are a joke. Even if you want to call them elections, they are legitimate elections. They should not be legitimized by any democratic country. I don't think the Russians are even building so much hope on them, and they're just the continuation of the situation as it is, which is Assad, his father, were always able to impose themselves on this country with this type of fake elections with 99%, people voting yes for them to stay. No one buys this anymore. I don't think even the Russians buy that these are real elections, and I hope there will be serious talks after this election saga is over.
Many thanks, Rim, and many thanks for joining us. Lena, what gives you hope? A final word, what could be maybe the key step to at least to some extent improve the situation for the people inside Syria?
I've focused before more on what can be done in the international community here in Gaziantep or for the humanitarian community, but also can be done on the international arena. So last week, UN negotiations started to update the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which could then end in the General Assembly resolution in June this year. So my hopes are that practitioners are more heard on how they have to deal with counterterrorism legislation and what kind of impacts on the humanitarian community they have to be then taken into consideration for updating the strategy and not only giving an overall framework, but really hands-on measurements or actions for the member states to then support the humanitarian community in supporting humanitarian assistance. And this is my hope.
Mm-hmm. So we finished with a couple of hopes, and I think that's good. It's more and more challenging after 10 years of Syria crisis. I think this has been really thought-provoking and really putting on the table that we need to challenge our thinking and our approaches even well beyond Syria crisis and about the humanitarian dilemmas and the political linkages. So I'm sure we will have to discuss this once again from various angles. I very much hope we don't have to do this in another 10 years' time. But many thanks for helping us to make progress on all these really challenging topics. Many thanks to our panelists, Lena, Rim, and Carsten. Many thanks to the team, our technical support. Please stay tuned. We surely will follow up, and all the best for all your work and all our joint efforts for the Syrian people. Thanks a lot and have a good afternoon or rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.